At an ordinary Sunday family dinner, nothing special about the date, my father said something he genuinely believed was a compliment. "You never needed us," he said, warm, a little misty from the wine, glancing around the table for agreement. "So we never worried about giving you enough." I'm Sloan Merrick. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a professional sailing captain, the kind of job where people pay me to take their boats across oceans, alone, for weeks at a time, because I'm good at surviving with no one else around, and because I've had a great deal of practice at exactly that. He meant it kindly. I want to be clear about that from the start, because this isn't a story about a cruel man saying a cruel thing on purpose. It's about a kind man saying a true thing out loud, for the first time in 25 years, without any idea what it actually meant. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I set my water glass down, and I asked if I could tell everyone at the table about a particular afternoon when I was 11 years old. If you're new here, I'm Sloan, and this channel is where I tell true, quiet stories about the moment a family finally hears itself say the thing it never meant to say out loud. No shouting, no dramatics, just an ordinary dinner table, and one sentence that changes how everyone at it remembers the last 25 years. If that's your kind of story, subscribe, because this one starts smaller than any story I've told you, and I think that's exactly why it hit as hard as it did. To understand why one offhand compliment could land the way it did, you have to understand the particular shape of Sunday dinners in my family, a tradition so old and so steady that none of us had ever really examined it, the way you stop noticing the exact color of a wall you've lived with your whole life. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Portland, Maine, the older of two daughters. My father, Garrett, spent 31 years as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant an hour south, the kind of methodical, hands-on man who fixed everything in our house himself and genuinely believed that letting a child struggle a little was one of the greatest gifts a parent could give. My mother, June, taught third grade for almost as long, the kind of teacher who managed 30 small children with calm, practiced patience all day and came home, I understand now, with more sympathy than I had as a teenager, with very little patience left over for anything that required more than surface-level smoothing. Sunday dinner at my parents' house has happened, with almost no exceptions I can remember, every single week for 25 years. Not a holiday tradition. Not a special occasion. Just an ordinary, recurring fact of our family's life, the kind of ritual that becomes invisible through sheer repetition. You stop noticing a thing is a tradition once it's simply the shape of every week. I'm 3 years older than my sister Brooke, and from as early as I have real memories, I was described, consistently, by nearly everyone in my extended family, using some version of the same handful of words. Easy. Independent. Low maintenance. Sloan's never been any trouble, my mother used to say to relatives, usually with real pride in her voice, usually while looking at me the way you might look at a well-built piece of furniture, appreciated, reliable, and not requiring much thought. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate what this was. I wasn't neglected in any way a stranger looking in would have recognized. I was fed, clothed, driven to school, told I was loved, and I believed it, because it was true. My parents loved me. That's never been the question underneath any of this. The question, the one I didn't have real language for until I was well into my 30s, was about something quieter and harder to point to, the specific, cumulative experience of being the child who was trusted to handle things on her own, long before she'd actually had any practice handling things on her own, simply because handling things on her own was easier for everyone else. I want to tell you about the boat, because it matters more than almost anything else I could describe. When I was 9, my father bought a small, second-hand sunfish sailboat, 14 feet, sun-bleached yellow sail, a little rust along the centerboard track, and named it, with real sentimentality, June Bug, after my mother. He kept it at a public launch about 10 minutes from our house, and I remember, distinctly, the day he brought it home on the trailer, how excited he was, how he told both Brooke and me, standing in the driveway, that he was going to teach us to sail that summer. Both of us. That was the plan, as I understood it at 9 years old, standing there looking at that little yellow boat like it was the beginning of something. It didn't quite work out that way, though not through any single dramatic decision anyone made on purpose. My father took me out on the June bug exactly twice that first summer, both times briefly, both times with him doing most of the actual sailing while I sat in the bow. Brooke, 6 at the time, was considered too young that year, and I remember feeling, honestly, a small private pride at being the one old enough to go. The following summer is the one I've thought about the most, though it took me over 2 decades to understand why. I was 11. Brooke was 8. It was a Saturday afternoon in July, warm, the kind of day that seems built for exactly the thing I was about to ask for. I found my father in the garage, doing something to the truck, and I asked him, plainly, the way an 11-year-old asks for something she's been building up the nerve to ask for, if he'd teach me to actually sail the June bug myself this summer, not just ride along, but really learn it, the way I'd overheard him telling a neighbor he intended to eventually teach both of us. He didn't say no. I want to be precise about that, because no would almost have been easier to carry than what he actually said. He was distracted, halfway under the hood of the truck, and he said, without looking up, in the same easy, unbothered tone he used for almost everything, "You'll figure it out." I remember standing there for a second, waiting for the rest of the sentence, the part where he'd set down the wrench and actually mean it as a plan rather than a dismissal. It didn't come. He straightened up a moment later, wiped his hands on a rag, and called over toward the kitchen door, where Brooke had just come outside, that he was going to help her with her shoelaces. She was learning to double knot them that summer, a small, ordinary parenting moment, nothing anyone watching would have thought twice about. He walked over to her, crouched down, and spent several careful minutes showing her exactly how to loop and pull the laces so they'd hold. I don't think my father remembers that afternoon at all. I've thought about it more times than I could count, and I genuinely believe, even now, that it registered to him as nothing, an ordinary Saturday, an ordinary shoelace lesson, an ordinary "you'll figure it out" tossed off to a daughter he trusted completely. I don't think there was any comparison happening in his mind between the two moments. I think that's actually the whole point. I did figure it out, eventually, though not that summer, and not with any help from him. I checked out 3 different books on sailing basics from our local library the following spring, reading them cover to cover in my room at night, memorizing diagrams of points of sail and rigging terminology I didn't fully understand yet. I started riding my bike down to the public launch on Saturday mornings that next summer, 12 years old, watching other people rig their boats, working up the nerve, eventually, to ask a retired couple who sailed a small Catalina most weekends if I could help them with lines in exchange for them showing me a few things. They said yes. Their names were Harold and Ruth Pemberton, and I've never told my parents, to this day, how many Saturday mornings I spent with 2 near strangers at a public boat launch, teaching myself, piece by piece, the exact thing I'd asked my own father for and been told to figure out on my own. By the time I was 14, I could rig and sail a small boat competently by myself. By 16, I was crewing informally for a local racing team that needed extra hands, the youngest person on the roster by nearly a decade, quietly proud every time an adult twice my age trusted me with a line during a mark rounding. None of this happened at home, on our own boat, with anyone in my family watching. It happened almost entirely somewhere else, with people who weren't related to me, because that's where the actual teaching was available. Meanwhile, over that same stretch of years, my father did teach Brooke to sail, patiently and consistently, on that same little June bug, most summers through her early teens. I want to be honest that I don't think this was ever a conscious choice to favor her over me. By the time Brooke was old enough to really learn, I'd already, quietly, stopped asking. I'd stopped needing him to teach me anything, because I'd already taught myself. I think, in his mind, that simply meant there was nothing left for him to give me in that particular area. He wasn't withholding something I still wanted. As far as he could see, I'd never really wanted it in the first place. I'd just gone and gotten it myself, the way I got everything myself, which he'd long since filed away as simply who I was. I want to mention one more memory from that stretch of my childhood, because I think it says something the boat story alone doesn't quite capture. When I was 13, my middle school held a father-daughter dance, and I remember asking my father, weeks in advance, whether he'd come. He said he would, and I believed him completely, the way you do at 13 when a parent tells you something plainly. He was nearly 40 minutes late that evening, having lost track of time helping a neighbor with a stalled car, and by the time he arrived I'd already spent most of the dance sitting at a folding table near the punch bowl, telling myself it was fine, that I didn't really need a dance partner anyway. When he did arrive, apologetic and a little breathless, I told him it was no big deal. I meant it, mostly, or told myself I did. I've wondered since how many times, across all those years, I said some version of "it's no big deal" to my own family before I actually believed it myself, simply because saying it enough times eventually makes it feel true, whether or not it started that way. I got my first real certification in my late teens, a basic keelboat sailing credential through a program at a marina 2 towns over, paid for with money I'd saved from a summer job at a seafood restaurant. I remember standing in line to take the written exam, 18 years old, surrounded mostly by adults twice my age, and feeling a specific, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with my family at all. Nobody from home came to see me pass. I hadn't told anyone the date, if I'm honest, because it hadn't occurred to me that it was the kind of thing you'd tell people about in advance. It was just something I was doing, the way I did most things by then, quietly, competently, and almost entirely alone. I want to mention Ruth Pemberton specifically one more time, because she said something to me once, the summer I turned 14, that I didn't fully understand until decades later. I'd shown up at the launch on a Saturday morning looking a little deflated, I don't remember exactly why now, some ordinary teenage disappointment, and she noticed, the way she always seemed to notice things about me that I hadn't said out loud. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just handed me a thermos of coffee she and Harold always brought, poured me a cup even though I was clearly too young for it, and said, "You know, you're allowed to just be a kid sometimes. You don't have to be so useful to everyone all the time." I laughed it off, the way I laughed most things off at that age. I've thought about that sentence more times over the years than almost anything either of my own parents ever said to me directly, which is, I think, its own kind of quiet commentary on where I actually learned to notice being cared for. I met Callum Reyes almost 15 years later, on my first professional delivery job, a mid-sized sloop headed from Newport down to the Caribbean with a 2-person crew. He was the other half of that crew, an experienced offshore sailor a decade older than me, and somewhere around day 4 of that trip, watching me handle a squall competently on my own without asking for help I clearly didn't need, he asked, almost idly, where I'd learned to sail. I told him the short version, self-taught, mostly, some help from strangers at a public launch as a kid. He was quiet for a moment, then said something I've thought about often since, most people who are that self-sufficient learned it because somebody made them. Not because they wanted to. I laughed it off at the time. It took me years to understand he probably hadn't been wrong. I want to be fair to my father here, because I think it matters for understanding what kind of story this actually is. He wasn't cold. He came to my high school graduation and cried, openly, in a way that embarrassed him more than it embarrassed me. He helped me move into 3 different apartments over the years without complaint, always the first to offer his truck. He has never, not once in 34 years, told me he was proud of me in a way that felt hollow or performed. The love was real. It still is. What I didn't have language for, until much later, was the specific, quiet difference between a father who loved me and a father who had simply never learned to notice when I needed something, because I'd gotten so good, so early, at making sure he never had to. My mother's part in all of this is harder for me to describe cleanly, in part because it operated so differently from my father's. She noticed more than he did, I think, even at the time. She's mentioned to me since, in passing, that she remembers me as a quiet, watchful child who rarely cried and rarely asked for things, and that she used to describe that quality to other mothers at school pickup with a kind of relieved pride, the specific relief of a working parent grateful for a child who required less. I don't think she ever asked herself, in any sustained way, whether that quietness was actually contentment or something closer to a very early, very effective form of self-management. It took me a long time to understand that a child who never asks for anything isn't necessarily a child who needs nothing. Sometimes she's simply a child who's already learned, correctly, that asking doesn't reliably work. I graduated high school a year early, at 17, mostly through my own initiative, I'd taken extra courses over 2 summers without much fanfare, driven myself to the community college campus for the necessary paperwork, and told my parents about the accelerated timeline only once it was already essentially decided. I remember my mother being surprised, genuinely, not upset, just surprised, in a way that told me she hadn't been tracking my coursework closely enough to have seen it coming. I didn't resent that at 17. If anything, I felt a familiar, private satisfaction at having handled something entirely on my own again, successfully, the way I handled most things by then. By the time I sat down at my parents' table on the Sunday this story is actually about, I'd built an entire career out of exactly the skill nobody in my family had ever formally taught me. I deliver sailboats professionally now, private clients, brokers, the occasional insurance company moving a vessel after a claim, sailing them, often alone, across stretches of open ocean that most people only ever see from an airplane window. 3 weeks before that dinner, I'd finished a solo delivery across the Atlantic, a 42-foot sloop bound from the Azores to Newport, 19 days at sea with only satellite check-ins for company. I want to describe what that kind of solo passage actually involves, briefly, because I think it matters for understanding the specific irony sitting underneath everything that happened at dinner. You sleep in short intervals, 20 minutes at a time, trusting an alarm to wake you before you drift too far off course or into another vessel's path. You fix what breaks yourself, at sea, with whatever's on board, because there's no one else to call. You learn to read weather systems days in advance because you can't afford to be caught unprepared with no crew to help you react. It's a job built entirely around not needing anyone else to be there. I'd been doing some version of that, in one way or another, since I was 12 years old at a public boat launch, and it had simply never occurred to me, until fairly recently, that the skill I'd built my entire adult identity and career around had started as a coping mechanism rather than a calling. Somewhere around day 11 of that Atlantic crossing, riding out a squall alone at 2 in the morning with the boat heeled hard and the radio silent for hours, I remember thinking, almost idly, how strange it was that this, cold, wet, entirely alone, entirely responsible for every decision, felt more familiar to me than almost anything about being back on land with my own family. I didn't examine that thought very closely at the time. There wasn't time to, and even if there had been, I don't think I was ready to. I called my boyfriend, Miles, from the marina the night before that Sunday dinner, still finishing up paperwork on the delivery. Miles has been with me for 4 years now, patient in a specific, steady way that I've come to rely on more than I usually admit out loud. He asked, almost in passing, whether I was going to say anything to my parents at dinner about the fact that neither of them had asked a single question about my 3-week solo Atlantic crossing since I'd gotten back, not one, in 3 separate phone calls since I'd landed. No, I told him, and I remember how quickly and automatically the answer came, without any real deliberation behind it. It's fine. It's just how they are. I've said some version of that sentence, it's fine, it's just how they are, probably 1,000 times over the course of my adult life, and it took me an embarrassingly long time to notice that I only ever said it about things that clearly weren't fine, framed in a tone specifically designed to end the conversation before anyone, including myself, had to sit with the actual feeling underneath it. Miles didn't push, the way he usually doesn't, though I could hear, in the small pause before he changed the subject, that he wasn't fully convinced. "You're allowed to want them to ask," he said, gently, before we hung up. I didn't have a good response to that. I still don't, entirely. It's strange, being genuinely good at reading weather patterns 3 days out, at anticipating exactly what an ocean is about to do before it does it, and still not having a reliable read on something as small as whether my own parents were going to ask about my life that week. I want to be honest about something I've had to sit with more directly in recent months, prompted partly by a comment Callum made almost in passing during a delivery job earlier this year. We were 3 days into a Caribbean run, and I'd handled a minor rigging failure alone, at night, without waking him for a shift he wasn't due for yet, competent, efficient, exactly the way I handle almost everything. He came up on deck at dawn, saw what I'd done, and instead of the usual easy compliment, he just looked at me for a second and said, "You know you're allowed to wake me up for things, right? That's what a crew is for." I told him I hadn't wanted to bother him. He said, not unkindly, that he'd noticed I said some version of that on nearly every trip we'd done together, for 6 years running, and that at some point it stopped reading as consideration and started reading as something else, a reflex, maybe, built so early and so thoroughly that I genuinely couldn't tell the difference anymore between choosing to handle something alone and simply never having learned there was another option. I didn't arrive at any grand realization that week, sitting with Callum's comment or Miles's gentle pushback. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's more true than a clean turning point would be. I mostly just carried both comments quietly, the way I carry most things, filing them away without doing much active work on them, the specific habit those two men had both just independently named without either of them fully realizing they were describing the same thing. I spent part of that final week before the dinner doing something smaller, almost private, going back through old delivery logs I keep for every job, noting how many times over the years I'd written some version of handled alone, no assistance required in the notes section, a habit I'd always framed to myself as professionalism rather than anything worth examining more closely. I counted 11 separate entries over 4 years where I'd specifically declined to wake a sleeping crewmate for something that, reading it back now, clearly warranted waking someone. I didn't do anything with that information right away. I just sat with it, the way I'd been sitting with most things that week, filing it quietly alongside everything else. If you've ever caught yourself doing something similar, handling things entirely on your own long after you actually needed to, and calling it strength instead of asking where the habit really came from, drop the word solo in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd genuinely like to know how many of you recognize this pattern from your own life, long before you ever have a dinner like the one I'm about to describe. I drove up to my parents' house that Sunday the way I always do, a little early, because arriving on time in my family has always meant arriving 10 minutes ahead, another small, unspoken rule none of us ever discuss out loud. I had no particular expectation for the evening beyond the ordinary rhythm of a Sunday dinner I'd attended several hundred times before. I certainly didn't expect it to be the dinner where anything actually changed. If anything, I expected exactly what I always expected, a warm, pleasant, slightly surface-level evening, followed by the specific quiet drive home I'd grown so used to that I'd stopped registering it as anything worth naming. The drive to my parents' house takes about 25 minutes from the marina where I keep most of my gear, a route so familiar I could probably drive it with my eyes closed, past the hardware store my father used to take me to on Saturday mornings, past the elementary school where my mother taught for nearly 3 decades, past the public boat launch where I taught myself to sail, still there, still busy most weekends with families rigging small boats exactly the way I once watched other people do. I passed the turnoff to that launch, like I always do, and glanced toward it out of habit rather than any particular feeling. I want to be honest that most Sundays, I don't think much about it at all anymore. It's just part of the landscape of my hometown, the way any place you pass 1,000 times eventually stops carrying much weight. My parents' house looked exactly as it always does on a Sunday, both cars in the driveway, porch light already on despite the early hour, the specific warm smell of my mother's cooking reaching the front steps before I'd even opened the door. My mother pulled me into a hug the moment I stepped inside, the same way she has for every single Sunday dinner I can remember attending. "You look tan," she said, which is what she says almost every time I come back from a delivery, a small, easy observation that has always stood in our family's particular shorthand, for the more specific questions she doesn't usually think to ask. Brooke arrived about 10 minutes after me, practically glowing, pulling her boyfriend Theo through the front door by the hand before either of them had even taken their coats off. "We have news," she announced, to the whole room, unable to hold it in for even the length of a proper hello. Theo had proposed the night before, apparently, at the restaurant where they'd had their first date 3 years earlier, a detail Brooke recounted in full, giddy detail before we'd even made it to the dining room, the ring catching the overhead light as she held out her hand for my mother to admire. I felt a real, uncomplicated wave of happiness for her, watching her tell the story. I want to be clear about that, because nothing that happened later that evening changes how genuinely glad I was, in that moment, for my sister. Nadia Petrov, our parents' longtime next-door neighbor, arrived shortly after, a small gift bag in hand, she'd apparently heard the engagement news already, from my mother, before Brooke had even had a chance to properly announce it to the rest of us, which made all of us laugh, the specific easy laughter of people who've known each other's family gossip networks for decades. I've always liked Nadia. She has a warm, unhurried way of paying attention to people, remembering small details about our lives that even some of our own relatives forget. She's the kind of neighbor who still asks specifically about my deliveries by name, remembering the names of boats I mentioned to her months earlier, something even some of my own relatives rarely manage. I mention her particularly because her presence, along with Theo's, mattered enormously to what happened later. She was, like Theo, someone entirely outside our family's established habits, with no old practice of simply letting certain comments pass without noticing them. We sat down to eat around 6, the dining room warm with the specific golden light of early evening, my mother's pot roast filling the whole downstairs with a smell I associate more with my childhood than almost anything else. My father opened a bottle of wine he'd apparently been saving for an occasion, delighted to have one, refilling glasses generously as the meal went on. Dinner unfolded warmly for most of the first hour. Theo, clearly a little nervous meeting so much extended family energy at once, relaxed steadily as the evening went on, laughing easily at my father's stories, visibly working to make a good impression on people whose opinion mattered enormously to him. I liked him immediately, the way I'd liked most of Brooke's serious boyfriends over the years, kind, a little earnest, plainly devoted to my sister in a way that was easy to see even on short acquaintance. At one point, an aunt near the middle of the table asked me, kindly enough, whether I'd been anywhere interesting lately, and I found myself giving the short, practiced version of an answer I'd refined over years of these dinners, a sentence or two about the Atlantic crossing, nothing about the 19 days alone, nothing about the squall I'd ridden out at 3 in the morning with no one to call. I've noticed, without ever quite deciding to do it on purpose, that I tend to make my own life sound smaller at that table than it actually is, the way you might instinctively lower your voice in a room where loud things have never quite been welcome. My father was in excellent spirits, holding court the way he always does at these dinners, telling an old story about the time Brooke, at 9, had insisted on sailing the June Bug entirely by herself across the small cove near our old boat launch, only to get the centerboard stuck and have to be towed back by a passing fisherman, mortified and soaked. The table laughed warmly. Brooke groaned good-naturedly through the retelling, clearly delighted despite herself, the way people usually are when an old, harmless family story gets its regular airing. He moved from that story into another, about teaching her to read a compass on the boat's small deck one August afternoon, patient and thorough in a way I recognized, watching him tell it, as genuinely tender, a father who clearly loved teaching his daughter something with his own hands, taking real pleasure in the memory of it even a quarter-century later. I noticed, somewhere around that story, the way I always notice without quite naming it as anything, that very few of my father's nostalgic stories that evening involved me at all, not with any real bitterness in the noticing anymore, just the same old familiar pattern, worn smooth by decades of repetition, reasserting itself the way it always does. My father moved from the June Bug story into another, the general shape of an evening I'd sat through more times than I could count, a few glasses of wine loosening him into his most expansive, most sentimental mode, a mode I'd genuinely never once, in 34 years, associated with anything but warmth. He loves an audience. He loves reminiscing, especially about summers on that little sailboat, a season of his life I understand now he genuinely considers among his happiest as a father. I noticed my mother, across the table, growing slightly quieter as the wine kept flowing and my father's nostalgia kept expanding. The particular quietness I'd later come to understand wasn't disengagement so much as a kind of practiced, protective bracing, though at the time, in the moment, I read it as nothing more than her usual dinner hosting focus, refilling water glasses, making sure everyone's plate stayed full. Miles caught my eye once from across the table, a small, familiar check-in look. I gave him the faintest possible nod, the specific shorthand couples develop over years of family dinners together. I'm fine, this is normal, I'll tell you about it later. I had no idea, giving him that small reassurance, how soon later was actually going to arrive, or how differently I'd be describing the evening once it had. By the time my mother brought out dessert, a simple yellow cake she'd made that morning, nothing fancy, just an ordinary Sunday dessert made a little more festive by Brooke's news. The whole table had settled into the easy, contented lull that comes after a good meal among people who genuinely like each other. My father, still holding his wine glass, leaned back in his chair, looking around at all of us with the specific warm satisfaction he gets at the end of a good family evening. "You know," he said, not as a toast exactly, just an offhand comment tossed into the general warmth of the room, "I was just thinking about how different you two turned out." He gestured, affectionately, between Brooke and me. Brooke needed a little more hand-holding growing up, and we were happy to give it. Sloane, though, he chuckled, shaking his head fondly, looking directly at me with what I recognized, even in the moment, as genuine pride. Sloane never needed us, he continued, warm, a little misty from the wine, glancing around the table for the easy agreement he clearly expected to find. "You never needed us, so we never worried about giving you enough." There was a strange half-second of silence after he said it, the kind of pause where a room hasn't yet decided how to receive something. A few relatives smiled, nodding, clearly hearing it exactly the way my father meant it, as praise, as a father's proud observation about a capable, self-sufficient daughter. I watched Theo's smile hold steady, but something shift slightly behind his eyes, the look of someone doing quick, quiet math he wasn't sure he was supposed to be doing out loud. Nadia's expression changed too, subtly, a flicker of something more careful replacing her earlier easy warmth. My mother, beside my father, had gone very still. Not shocked, exactly, I understood, even in that moment, that this was closer to recognition. She knew exactly what he'd just said, and exactly what it meant, in a way none of the guests around the table possibly could. I set my water glass down. Into the small, warm, still mostly oblivious quiet that followed, the kind of quiet where most of the table still assumed this was simply a nice moment, a father's fond observation about his capable daughter, I spoke. I kept my voice level, the same calm, unhurried register I use at sea when something's gone wrong and panic would only cost time. "Dad, can I tell everyone about something? I think it actually explains what you just said better than you realize." He blinked at me, still smiling, the particular open, unguarded expression of a man who has no idea anything has shifted. "Sure, honey, go ahead." "When I was 11, I said, I asked you to teach me to sail the June bug. Really teach me, not just ride along, but actually learn it, the way I'd heard you tell Mr. Alderman next door you were planning to teach both of us eventually." I kept my eyes on him, gentle, without any edge in my voice, the way I'd practiced saying difficult things to people at sea when the situation demanded clarity instead of emotion. "You were working on the truck. You said, you'll figure it out. And then you went and helped Brooke with her shoelaces." The table had gone fully quiet now, even the cousins near the far end catching the shift in tone. "I don't remember that," my father said, his smile faltering slightly, more confused than defensive. "Sloane, that's such a small thing, I know you don't remember it," I said, still gentle. "That's actually the important part, Dad. It was small enough that you forgot it completely." It wasn't small to me. I spent the next 3 summers teaching myself to sail out of library books and from 2 strangers at the public launch who were kind enough to let a 12-year-old help them with lines in exchange for showing her a few things. Harold and Ruth Pemberton. You've never met them. I never told you about them, because by the time I was good enough to mention it, it didn't feel like something you'd want to hear about. I didn't mean for you to," he started, and I watched something genuine shift in his face, the particular alarm of a man realizing a story he's told fondly for decades has an entirely different ending than the one he's always imagined. "I know you didn't mean for me to figure it out entirely alone," I said. "I actually believe that. But I did. And so when you say I never needed you, you're right. I didn't. But that's not because I was naturally independent, Dad. It's because you told an 11-year-old to figure it out on her own, and she believed you, and she did exactly that, for basically everything, from that day forward." I paused for a moment, aware of every face at the table now turned toward me, aware of Brooke's hand still resting loosely near her ring, aware of how strange it was to be having this particular conversation in the middle of what was supposed to be her celebration. I actually finished a solo crossing 3 weeks ago, I said, quieter now. 19 days, alone, across the Atlantic. Nobody at this table has asked me a single question about it. I'm not saying that to make anyone feel guilty tonight, especially not you, Brooke. I'm saying it because I think it's the same thing happening again, just in a grown-up version. I got good enough at needing nothing that everyone stopped noticing I might still want something. Uncle Neil, near the far end of the table, had gone quiet in a way I'd never once seen from him at a family dinner, his usual easy chatter completely extinguished. One of my younger cousins had put down her fork entirely, watching with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone realizing an adult conversation had suddenly become far more serious than anyone had prepared her for. My father sat back slightly, his wine glass still loosely in his hand, his eyes moving between me and my mother, searching for a version of the last 30 seconds that didn't mean what it plainly meant. My mother's hand had gone still on the tablecloth. She didn't speak right away. In that particular silence, at that particular table, the absence of an answer was its own kind of confirmation. "Mom," Brooke said quietly, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years, looking between our parents and me, her own engagement dinner suddenly reorganizing itself around a story she'd never once heard. Did that actually happen? Stay with me, because what my mother says next is the entire reason I'm telling you this story today. If you've ever watched one parent's silence answer a question the other parent couldn't, hit subscribe right now. I promise you it's worth staying for exactly how she answered. My mother closed her eyes briefly before she answered. "Yes," she said, finally, quietly. "I remember that summer." Nobody said anything else for a moment. Theo had gone very still beside Brooke, clearly unsure whether it was his place to react at all to something this deeply embedded in a family he'd only recently joined. Nadia's eyes had moved to me, steady, something like quiet recognition in them that I wouldn't fully understand until later that evening. My father set his wine glass down slowly, both hands now resting flat on the table, looking at me with an expression I'd genuinely never seen on him before, not anger, not defensiveness anymore, just a kind of stunned, unhurried grief settling in as he actually sat with what he'd just said and what it had apparently cost. "I don't know what to say," he said finally, quietly, more to the table than to me specifically. "I don't, Sloane, I genuinely thought I was complimenting you." "I know," I said, and I meant it, without any bitterness in the saying. "That's actually the whole reason I wanted everyone to hear it. If you'd meant it cruelly, it would almost be simpler. It's harder to sit with a compliment that turns out to mean something completely different once you actually look at it." I didn't let the moment take over the whole rest of the evening, not entirely. Once the initial weight of it had settled into something quieter, I turned back toward Brooke directly, softening my voice. "None of this is about you," I told her, meaning it completely. "I need you to hear that clearly, especially tonight of all nights. This isn't a competition between us, and it never has been. I'm genuinely, completely happy for you and Theo." She nodded, tearful, and reached for my hand across the table, a small, real gesture I've thought about often since. My mother suggested, gently, that we still have the cake, and Brooke, to her real credit, managed a small, watery laugh and agreed, saying she wasn't going to let good cake go to waste over a very Merrick family moment, a small attempt at levity that eased the room just enough for the evening to wind down with some grace. We sang, a little unevenly, and Brooke blew out the single celebratory candle my mother had stuck in the cake for the occasion, and for a strange, suspended few minutes, the ordinary rituals of a happy family dinner continued, layered awkwardly over everything underneath them. Guests filtered out gradually after that, with the particular careful, gentle awkwardness of people who've witnessed something they weren't quite meant to see. Nadia hugged my mother a little longer than usual on her way out, saying nothing specific, just present. Theo stayed close to Brooke for the rest of the night, quietly steady in a way that told me, watching them, that whatever had just happened wasn't going to become a problem between the two of them. Once most everyone had gone, my mother and I finally had the conversation that had been circling underneath the whole evening. She didn't dress it up with excuses. "I've told myself for 25 years that you were just naturally independent," she said, her voice unsteady. It was easier than admitting we let you handle things a child shouldn't have had to handle alone. I'm not proud of that, Sloane. I don't have a clean way to explain it that makes it better. It wasn't a clean explanation. I've learned, in my line of work, that the true ones at sea rarely are. You fix what you can with what you have, and you're honest about what's still broken. She told me more that night than she usually does, that after I was born, both she and my father had been genuinely overwhelmed those first few years, and that somewhere in there, without either of them consciously deciding it, they'd started leaning on the fact that I simply didn't seem to need as much. It felt like a relief at the time, she admitted. And then it just became who we thought you were. I don't think either of us ever stopped to ask whether that was actually true, or whether we'd just made it true because it was convenient. My father's reckoning came slower than my mother's, and more haltingly. He called me 2 days later, clearly uncomfortable with the kind of direct emotional territory he doesn't often enter, and told me, in fits and starts, that he'd gone out to the garage that night after everyone left and stood looking at the June bug for a long time. I genuinely don't remember that afternoon, he said. But I believe you. And I think the fact that I don't remember it is exactly the problem you were trying to explain to me. It wasn't a perfect apology. It was, I think, an honest one, as far as it went, and I've come to understand the difference between a perfect apology and an honest, incomplete one matters more than I used to think. I want to mention a small moment with Theo that I've thought about since, though we've only spoken a handful of times. He found me in the kitchen while I was helping clear plates and said, a little carefully, for what it's worth, I don't think I've ever seen anyone stay that calm while saying something that hard. Brooke's lucky to have a sister like you. I didn't expect it to land the way it did, coming from someone who'd known our family for all of a few months. Nadia called me about a week later, unexpectedly, just to check in. I've lived next door to your parents for almost 20 years, she told me, and I always sensed there was something underneath the surface with you specifically, something nobody ever quite said out loud. I want you to know I don't think less of any of you. I think what you did took real courage, actually, saying it the way you did instead of just letting it pass again. I want to be honest that I didn't hear only kindness in the days after that dinner. One of my aunts, my father's older sister, called a few days later, not unkindly exactly, but clearly uncomfortable, to say she thought I'd embarrassed my father unnecessarily at what should have been Brooke's night. I understood where she was coming from even as I disagreed with it. I told her, as calmly as I could, that I hadn't planned any of it, that I'd simply answered honestly when a comment landed somewhere it clearly wasn't supposed to. She didn't fully accept that explanation, and we've spoken only briefly since. I've made my peace with the fact that not everyone in my extended family is going to see that evening the way I do, and that this, too, is something I mostly have to sit with on my own, a small, familiar irony I noticed almost as soon as I recognized it. Callum texted me a single line when I told him what happened, the kind of message that only makes sense once you already know someone well, told you it wasn't a coincidence. I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, in a way that surprised me. Brooke reached out to me directly a few days after the dinner, tender in a way I hadn't quite seen from her before. She told me she wanted to learn to actually sail, properly, and asked if I'd teach her, not the June bug, not our father's old boat, but something new, just the two of us. We went out together for the first time 3 weekends later, and I found myself, at one point, explaining points of sail to my sister on open water, patient in exactly the way nobody had ever quite been patient with me, and it didn't feel like grief anymore. It felt like something closer to repair. A few weeks after that, without any real announcement, my father asked if I'd help him get the June bug seaworthy again. It had been sitting in the shed for years, sail cracked, hull needing real work. We spent 2 Saturday afternoons on it together, mostly quiet, mostly just working side by side, and at one point he asked me, a little stiffly, to show him how I check rigging tension before a passage. I did. It wasn't an apology exactly. But it was, I think, the closest thing to actually teaching me something he'd managed in 25 years, and I let it count for what it was. I want to be honest that I didn't process all of this cleanly myself, the way it might sound from the outside looking in. I talked about it more than once with Miles over the following weeks, and I noticed myself, more than once, catching that same old reflex, starting to minimize what had happened, to tell him it wasn't that big a deal, before stopping myself and actually sitting with the fact that it clearly had been, or I wouldn't have said anything at that table at all. Old habits like that don't disappear just because you've named them once, out loud, in front of 10 people. I'm still working on that part, some days more successfully than others. I brought some of it to a few conversations with Callum over the following months, too, mostly during long, quiet stretches on deliveries when there wasn't much else to do but talk. He didn't try to fix anything, which I appreciated more than I expected to. Mostly he just asked good questions, the kind that made me actually finish a thought instead of deflecting it halfway through with a joke, which I've noticed is another old habit of mine that I'm only now starting to really see clearly. 6 weeks after the dinner, my mother sent me a photo, unprompted, of the June bug freshly repainted, its hull a bright, clean yellow again, sitting in the driveway rather than the shed. Underneath it, she'd written a single line, "Your father wants to know if you'd take it out with him sometime, if you're willing." I sat with that message for a long time before I answered. I said yes. We took it out together on a quiet Sunday morning in early June, just the two of us, no dinner attached to it, no occasion at all beyond the two of us and a small boat on calm water. He let me handle the tiller the entire time, watching more than talking, and at one point, unprompted, asked me to walk him through exactly how I'd read the wind before a passage, the way a student might ask a teacher, rather than the other way around. I did. It felt, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, like an ordinary, unremarkable afternoon with my father, which is, I've come to understand, sometimes exactly what repair actually looks like. Not a grand gesture. Just an ordinary Sunday, done a little differently than all the ones before it. That's my story. An ordinary Sunday dinner, no holiday, no special occasion beyond my sister's good news, a compliment my father genuinely meant kindly, and a sentence I'd been carrying quietly for over 20 years finally getting the only thing it had ever actually needed, the true story behind it, told plainly, in my own voice, at my own table, in my own time. "You never needed us," he said. He wasn't wrong, exactly. He just never stopped to ask why that was true, or what it had actually cost to become that way. Sometimes the kindest sounding sentence in a family is the one that reveals the most, precisely because nobody meant it as a wound. You don't always need a villain to name what happened. Sometimes you just need the courage to say, out loud, in your own voice, what a compliment accidentally confessed. So tell me, if your father had said that to you, at an ordinary dinner, in front of people who love you, would you have told the whole table the real story right there, the way I did, or waited until you could say it privately? Let me know in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, subscribe for the next one, and I'll see you in the next story.